I want to just spend it, well, I guess I stop right here, pointing out really why we got interested in complex systems and complex adaptive systems to really get a better handle on understanding that behavior of systems, how they respond to changes, perturbations. And I'm going to go through and just highlight a few things. I'm going to get into complex systems between Lyle and Christian and the readings. You have a good handle on that. But I want to kind of point out, based on this, a couple of those characteristics of systems, you know, the bottom-up interactions, cross-scale hierarchies, nonlinear feedbacks. In terms of trying to approach this, you want to really see, bring some examples. How do people try to quantify some of that? Can we put some numbers on it, or what approaches have people used to put some numbers on it to make it work? Because you know, this complex systems theory, you can make it work, I can make it work, and Christian can make it work either per se. So at this stage, you know, figuring things out as we do with research, we're trying to take things apart and saying, well, what do we know? How can we deal with nonlinear feedbacks thresholds? How can we deal with cross-scale hierarchies? Things like that. And hopefully then with the idea, when you think about management, think about the exercise, you can bring that in and say, well, you know, here are some ways how other people have dealt with it, maybe we can make it work, and here's what we can learn from it when we look at it. And the main thing here, I'm going to rush this, is really what systems do is really this interplay. On one hand side, they are fairly stable and robust ecosystems. Think about that, or even, I guess, for that matter, you know, individuals. Think about our temperature regulation in our body, the sweating and shivering and stuff. It's very robust, keeps us very stable. On the other hand, the systems can be quite responsive and adaptable, and a minor shift can lead to some major changes in the system. And it's really that interplay between those two things that we have to manage in the system on that. So you have adaptation to current conditions. I highlighted before, this is what companies have been doing. Getting very efficient, having the system adapted to our current condition. And of course, the trade-off there is adaptability to new conditions. So the balance between having a life and getting tenure, in this example, I figure that fits an academic setting.
That's Ellie's situation right now.
Yeah. It's really what we need to manage. So how much adaptability is enough? What drives adaptability in a system? Of course, there is no simple answer, but if you look in the theory, adaptability theory, they say that the adaptability in a system is a direct function of uncertainty. If you don't have uncertainty, you need adaptability. And so in natural ecosystems, when there is no uncertainty, you find less adaptability. And we'll get into some details on that, but it's something to consider. In some ways, you kind of almost can use it backwards. If I don't know the adaptability, maybe I can make an assessment about uncertainty. Or if I want to get a handle on uncertainty, I can look at measures of adaptability on that. And I find this complex system story not only useful for management on that, but I find it actually really an important measure that I've been pushing lately, also for research on that. In some ways, by thinking about adaptability as a context, that makes us think about, you know, theories that we test a little different. I mean, like this diversity stability theory, you know, Tillman's work and everybody else, one scale on that. There is no particular context. If you think about a context of adaptation to current conditions, you'll find out, as I mentioned in a few minutes, cross-scale hierarchies are important. They're totally ignored when we just do a test of the diversity stability in a vacuum on that. So if you think about your scientific career, keeping the adaptability theorem in the background may make you look at testing, you know, basic scientific theories being a little different on that. So I'm going to go through just a few things and talk about how people have tried to quantify and measure, try to get a handle on it, and there's no simple quick solution. As I pointed out, the answer is not 42 on that, but...
and these examples are directly related to the exercise we'll do.
Well, it's kind of morphing slowly into that. The first thing about, you know, diversity and redundancy Heterogeneity is one of the big principles, characteristics of complex systems on that. And of course, when you look at it, and Christian kind of already mentioned that, when we look at species and we do kind of a rank distribution, we find something, usually lots of species, a few species quite a few species have a big distribution. This is percent cover, this is a conceptual one. And other species have a small distribution. You find that classical J-shaped distribution for those kind of settings. And then we think about compensation on that. Why are we interested in diversity? It's really because we want to see what happens when things change on that. And so this is just a conceptual graph. I'll highlight a few numbers from some of our studies later. But you find out the dominant species, they are adapted to current conditions, right? That's why they're dominant. And quite likely that means if things change, they may not be adapted that well. So they might likely go down, or can go down on that. We look at the minor species, on that the rare species, and then again, some of them may disappear, and other species are just rare because the conditions aren't optimal for it yet. So when the conditions change, they may go up and provide some of those functions, leading to redundancy. So when we think about redundancy, we want to think about, or diversity, we want to think about compensation. I'm not sure redundancy is the proper word. There seems to be perfect overlap, but getting into that direction of that, and I'll highlight that. So in third, actually, when we looked at studies, we found different patterns. Some of them where the minor species took over and replaced major species, and we fenced fans. Other ones where we actually had new invasive species coming in, natives, but species that weren't in the system before, and they took over some of the functions. So one thing I want to point out, I've always struggled when we start grouping things, what to measure for diversity, and of course what we do measure usually is species diversity. That's been the kicker on that, and partially in the US we have the Endangered Species Act, so by law we have to pay attention to that. But if you think about ecosystems and see ecosystem adaptation, species is really a meaningless grouping. I mean, individuals of the species don't even interact necessarily together. It's not a popularity, it's not a community. So I found that provides very little information per se. And so if you take a mechanistic approach and focus on adaptability, it's really not the species that matters, but what do they do? Not where they come from, even whether they're exotic or not. Of course, I'm an immigrant to the US, so don't care where you come from, I care what you do. And so when you think about traits, there's really, in terms of adaptation, two different types of traits to separate. One of them is what the traits that determine what a species does to facilitate the ecosystem processes and functions. Some people call it functional traits. I think I now prefer effect traits. Actually, as you've seen with Christian, if you look in the literature and you see functional traits, everything is a functional trait. I've seen leaf area and morphological traits, they call it all functional traits. And that again is very confusing. So separate the traits and their impact on ecosystem processes and traits that determine how a species responds to changes, response traits. And there's been some literature that kind of tries to separate that. And that allows you then, like we did with the master's thesis of one of my students, where we went through 318 understory species in our study sites, a thinning study, a large-scale thinning study, if you want hectares involved. And we sorted them in terms of their effect traits. So we're looking at wildlife habitat, food networks here. We looked at them, are they insect pollinated? So when you have insect pollinated, you have parasites or predators of insect pollinators, you have parasites or predators of insect pollinators and going down. So that feeds the food chain. Do they produce fleshy fruits, especially the berries, of course, a big important factor for songbirds on that. And then are they palatable? That's directly focused on deer and elk as one of the characteristics. So that's the ecosystem service we're after, the food chain in this setting that is providing good habitat for a variety of species. And then we subset those species and said, well, what's the response traits here? And we picked 3 of them, obviously, no coincidence that you can relate them to climate change. Can they handle drought? Can they sprout actually and respond to come right back after fire? And can they handle increased temperatures? So figuring that those are three things that are predicted to happen in Oregon's forest. And then we looked at our thinning studies and said, what happens to those? And the paper is out in the CGFR. Actually, I need to change that. This is still in prep. It's been published in the recent issue. But basically what we found out that when we look at the unthinned controls on that, this was the setting, drought tolerant species. I just picked insect pollinator here as the process. This is the different response type groups. And you find various settings and various responses that generally go up, except the drought tolerant species in dense conditions, I mean in open conditions, they weren't very competitive in unthinned stands. When we look at that after thinning, everything went up to begin with, so we increase the insect pollinated species through thinning, and the insect pollinated species that can handle increased drought, increased temperature, and increased fires on that. And here you see now that the drought tolerant pattern switched, that in these open conditions after the disturbance they were able to invade, come in, and expand on that. So now we have something we can conclude that if we think about capacity building, remember I talked about capacity building on that, if you thin it in this way to, we increase the likelihood that this wildlife habitat function is maintained under the climate change conditions. So we built that capacity and strengthened those arrows that keep the ecosystem in that desirable future conditions. I'm going to go through this here, just switching to scales. Christian already pointed that out, and I just want to highlight actually some stuff that Phil and I have worked on since then. The reputation of boreal forest as a low diversity forest is really an artifact, or maybe a leftover, from the fact that when we talked about diversity, we still hung up on common species on that. And if we deviate from common species, as Christian already pointed out, we have clones to deal with especially with those species like aspen and black spruce that is widely distributed. We have hybridization. Think about spruces. I mean, everybody's doing it with everybody. Seems like with the spruces you find all kinds of mixtures on that. You have migrating species, songbirds from the tropics that feed into that system. And of course, there's a diversity of insects, and then I guess especially recently it seems like the diversity of decay fungi that we totally ignored, partially because we couldn't identify them before the DNA analysis. So the reputation of a forest, which then has led us to believe or accept that it's a simple forest, so a simple management regime like large-scale disturbances is acceptable and fits the ecology of the system, is really an architect of us focusing on that species level. And if you think complex systems is cross-scale, hierarchical, I think this hits you in the face that you can't just pick out one scale and drive your management of that system by an emphasis of that single scale. That kind of goes, I guess the next step, this is a paper we have in review. Actually, it looks like it's going to come out before it's science. But we looked at the natural regeneration in our forests. And again, starting with our thinning study, eventually, once we went through the analysis, we kind of actually went back and rewrote the paper a little bit, because what we really find out that depends on the scale we're looking at, we find different driving factors on that. So when you think about what drives natural regeneration, in the past we have plenty of studies that pick on each one of these, and it really have to put all those pieces together on that. When you think about the germination, seedbed conditions are critical on that. Sapling growth here, it's the local neighborhood that drives that. The species composition is a seed source issue. That's almost that, I guess if you want to use the stand scale, a little bit bigger scale. And then whether you have a dominance of Douglas fir or hemlock, that's a regional pattern on that. So to understand natural regeneration, if you look through the literature, you'll find plenty of studies that stick at one of these scales. But to me, to really understand it, you really have to look at the variety of scales. because all those papers, including my own, so I can take credit for that, we concluded, yes, there is an impact if you're thin, you get more regeneration, but it's highly variable. And that's the standard pattern you'll find. You'll find certain treatment differences, or maybe not, but they're highly variable. And this, I think, explains part of the variability when you start thinking scale and bringing it into your analysis and into your thinking. And that's actually one of the key factors that I think about, actually, even for the exercise now. You get into the scale issue that you'll deal with later this afternoon and tomorrow. I think one of the major things, how to deal with uncertainty, how to deal with variability, is really stepping back and looking at what scale do you assess your success on that. And in the past, what we've done is we've done it on a stand-by-stand scale on that. You kind of do something and you have your vision. If you talk about the managers, actually I know when I took forestry classes, what are you going to do with this stand? The first thing, what do you want it to look like in 50 years? And then you do what you need to do to make it look that way in 50 years or 100 years or so. And that means you kind of, make a lot of assumptions about your ability to manipulate and what the future conditions would be. If you deviate from that and saying what I really want to look at, I'm going to assess my success on a landscape or ownership level. That means I allow some stands to go above or below my target, as long as on average I kind of fit that target. Well, the example that Dave Coates kind of pointed out in BC, they want 80% stocking on all their land. So what they're really doing, where they spent their money, is on those few sites where they just don't get it because of one problem or another. They take a lot of attention, they take a lot of the money, and they fight in the fight to get those up from 50, 60 to 80 on that. If they just step back and say, on average I want 80, and it's okay if I have a problem site, I can live with 1 or 2 or 3 sites that have 50 or 60 or 70, because other ones will have 90 or 95. Their management input would actually be a lot less, and the landscape will look quite a bit different on that.
Social acceptability, though, would play a role in that. And I know in BC a lot of people complain about the landscape, what it looks like. If they see a place that doesn't have enough trees or it feels like it's not natural, then they might not accept it as much. Or...
Yeah, I mean, anytime you deal with these kind of conditions, you have to bring the social acceptability in, and part of that may be an educational issue on that, and part of it is, well, I mean, for some people it's tough. Like for my father, I know if I drove by a stand that didn't look nicely planted, he said, oh, well, they're not good foresters on here. And so there is some cultural values and stuff that come in there as well. And I mean, that's one of the challenges of the education, I think, that we have to do, and the social component has to be part of that, to deal with that. Especially silviculture, we are kind of in this bind where we manage very small scale processes, as I mentioned before, the germination, it's a few centimeters squared. For a seedling you have, I think Wagner's study showed a 2-meter radius. For a 60, 70-year-old tree, our studies show a 20-meter radius around that tree, determine how the tree grows. So we're managing very small scale processes, but success is at the ownership level or at the landscape level. So yes, the landscape may look quite different. And there may be some educational component that needs to go into that. Switching to thresholds is one of those principles and nonlinear feedbacks and thresholds. That's a key function of complex systems. On that, you've probably seen this hysteresis diagram here. What you have is an ecosystem that is increased by herbivory. Then you have a drought, for example. The system may change in biomass quite a bit, and then it seems to come in at a separate level. We're looking at basins of attraction, things like that. And so the question really is, how close we think about in terms of management. Can you get some information when you hit one of these thresholds on that? And as you can see here in this example, actually most thresholds to me, we shouldn't really think of them as one-dimensional thresholds. It's really the interactions here that seem to drive this. It can handle a lot of herbivory, but then when a drought comes or another disease comes, the system will flip into a different state. And here's what some people have done. You won't have to do this today in your exercise, but as you think about thresholds, there are some work, especially Martin Scheffer from the Netherlands has probably been the most productive person in terms of that. And he kind of looked at, in the past, in various records, what determined the threshold. And what you see here is, where they had the greenhouse, the icehouse conditions there in terms of calcium. And then he found that the autocorrelation was a good indicator on that. And I'll show you why. I guess I'm simplifying here. But if you think about that, if you have something, he used the word resilient, but something that is solid in the bowl, if you shift things here, you see changes in the y-axis quite a bit. If you're on the flat here, you shift things a little and to the right, your y-axis doesn't change much, which means your autocorrelation is higher. So the closer you come to a flat surface, in this case the hump to the next one, the higher the autocorrelation should be. That's the theoretical basis behind his works. So if you think about that, if you want to look at how closed systems are to changes, to flipping points, to thresholds, if you have long-term data, there are some ways that people at least have successfully done that. Usually with forestry, though, we don't have long-term data. And there is actually a paper that just came out. Steve Carpenter wrote a little summary of that, where they point out that you can look at it the same way in a spatial context. Because the Scheffer's paper had a temporal context. And so they point out if you have a system, going at a flat value, if you make a point source, or if you see a point source disturbance, how far does that disturbance spread from there into the adjacent landscape? And if your system is very stable, very resilient, the spread will be very narrow. If your system is already close to a tipping point, then it may spill over on that. And I think, this has just come out here a few months ago, not even. But this is kind of the stuff I think we in forestry have some good options, especially with our inventory data, to kind of maybe get a handle on some of this kind of stuff.
As an indicator?
As an indicator how close we are to thresholds and tipping points on that. I haven't thought through exactly what kind of study one needs to set up, but you're the upcoming shining bright research star, so you can think about that too. I'm just throwing out ideas to.
They will come up with ideas this afternoon.
Yeah, it's good.
You'll be surprised.
So the last thing that this directly gets to the exercise. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Panarchy cyclone. Who's already seen this or heard of this in some fashion or another? Okay, I guess I'll have to go through it a little bit on that. This is really more than anything, I guess, was Holling's idea, and Gunderson worked on that, and they worked quite a bit actually in social systems as well. But they basically point out that you can break the development of certain systems into 4 different phases on that. I think I have, oops, yeah, I haven't come up here. You have, what do they call it now? What do they call the phase?
The R phase there.
Yes, the growth phase on that. And this is the stuff we typically manage, especially on industrial forest operations, all that. A lot of biomass production, a lot of growth, things are happening, things are developing. And then you come into this conservation phase.
That's the phase that the foresters would like to keep the forest in.
Yes, actually, a lot of times we cycle in this one. I'll get into that in a minute. But if you leave it alone, eventually it goes into some conservation phase. I guess you could call it old growth in some settings. Mature forest where you're not accumulating more biomass, it's plus minus stable. And then what happens, you get into the release phase. It could be a fire, could be insect, doesn't have to kill all the trees in that, but there's something really, shaking things up. And then you have a reorganization phase when things kind of get put together. And what they suggest is that systems just like forests kind of cycle through these phases on that. And to me there's an important thing to point out, and what have we done in forestry? Oops, oh man, I'm a little too fast here on that. Oops. Can I get back here?
The arrows.
Yeah.
Oh, it's even in English. Okay, yeah. So the first thing that the cycle points out, if you look at it, it shows out that change is the rule rather than the exception. Is one of the things that they make very clear with this Panarchy cycle. Stability is the exception rather than the rule. And a lot of systems, actually that's why I put this one up, has multiple stable phases or multiple basin of attractions here. This is the Lorentz attractor. And it's one that I put this one on it. It can be simple like that. It could be complicated like this. And it could kind of look at, if you wanted to 3D surface, look something like this. So that is something that foresters, we know, but we haven't really formally paid attention to on that. And I'll point out why that is important. The other thing that in the past, in terms of forestry, we've paid a lot of attention to succession, what happens in there. And we've kind of, in some ways, decoupled that from, I don't know what this is coming. Oh, this, that's right, that's right. We have decoupled that from the disturbance ecologists that kind of point out, how the system gets set back to an earlier successional status. So what the Panarchy cycle is doing is tying those things together. And this is one of the Oliver and Larsen's and dynamics diagrams. If you've taken any silviculture class, I know I use it in my class, that's one of the standard features. So our silviculture classes, we have really focused on this part here. We focus on exploitation, maybe the conservation at the end. Most of the time, we're staying in this exploitation, this growth phase and all that. And what Gunderson and Olin really point out, where things are happening, where the ecosystem is changing and adapting to changing conditions, is not during this growth phase. It's during this release and reorganization phase on that. And you can think about it, if you go into a stand, 30, 40, 50-year-old stand, or even 100-year-old stands, you come back 10 years later, if you go to the stand we have here, I'm going to show, some friends what that stand is like that the cool silviculture profs brought you here during 2013. Probably can't tell the difference on that. If you come in the stand you're doing right after the fire or so, and you come back 10 years later, you won't find them. It's a different world, or at least things change quite a bit. Those are the dynamic things on that. And those big disturbances, that's when the systems are reshaped. It's the 1,000-year flood that reshapes the river level on that. It's not the annual spring cycle on that. So what it really does is it kind of completes the cycle here and focuses the attention on the disturbances as an integral part of ecosystems that shapes the systems in the future and that allows the systems to adapt to the future. So how does that play out in management on that? We use thinning as an example. I've worked with thinning studies, so I bring that in. If we prescribe a thinning of forest, if you look in the objective, the main objectives, the only objective is to encourage the tree growth of the trees you leave behind. That's why we thin, right? And so that means we pay attention to this phase and this phase only, if that's our driver of the prescription. Now, we know that if we thin it, even in the conservation stage, there will be carryover. The tree rigor will be higher. You probably have a better height diameter ratio, so it's less prone to fall over in the wind, probably more stable with ice storms up here. Bigger trees, like Douglas fir, would be more fire resistant, so some of the oaks, bigger bark on that. So there's a carryover there in that. You go into the release phase. One thing that happens really, we have understory vegetation that it will increase after thinning. That's a carryover into the release phase. And if you remember your good old Howard Brook example, that understory vegetation kept the nutrients in place when the trees were gone. So, in terms of stability, especially nutrient cycling, that may be the only thing you got during some of those release stages. And of course, then you go to the reassembly or reorganization stage. You know, the trees may be more vigorous, they may be able better to sprout, maybe better seed production, you may have a seed bank, especially with shrubness cones, so that thinning, you know, will influence that as well. And so what you really think about is, would a thinning prescription be different if you didn't just focus on this exploitation phase, but think about adaptation of the system throughout this? And you know, our studies early on, I think I have it on the next one, I don't know. So our studies early on show that yes, they may be, so you can look at the silviculture prescription as I mentioned capacity building early on in one of the first slides, setting the system up that it can go through that phase and maintain, you know, and recover nutrient cycling, clean water and wildlife habitat, everything that goes through with that. And especially, of course, if you have a little bit more of a focus, like our example with the wildlife, we know that if we stand a certain way and protect, especially some of the understory species, we can thin in a way that in the future the likelihood, even with disturbances, that we have the food production, the insect pollinators and stuff there, and when the climate changes, is higher than that. So that is a way of how we can take some of those numbers and think about thinning as capacity building for disturbances. As one example. So but Panarchy here, I'm just getting a little closer and closer to the exercise, I'm zeroing in a little bit more. You know, Panarchy is really not just that one cycle, it really becomes a Panarchy when you have multiple nested cycles on that. And they have some, actually we'll get into that, the slow and fast ones, but what they kind of saying, we have small and larger scale cycles, and the small scale feeds into the larger things through revolt. Actually, I'm not sure that revolt is the right thing. Actually, I'm not sure I like release. If I probably would make the cycle, I would call it innovation rather than release in the Panarchy cycle. If you look at it, you know, yes, it releases something old that's backward looking, innovation is forward looking.
They were meaning energy, so innovation just
release of energy and then you have innovation,
On that. And in some ways, if you look forward, it's innovation as there's, you know, things are reassembling in different ways. Based on the memory and so an example from our small cycle here can influence a large cycle. The one that's typically used is lightning strikes, and what happened in that spot where the lightning strike may determine whether the landscape will burn up or not. If it had been treated before or happens to be a rock, maybe nothing will happen. If there is enough fuel to get things started, go into the crowd fire, it may carry it through and yellow sort of burn for a few months until the snow finally put it out. So a nice thing of how, you know, a small scale treatment of a stand or part of a stand or even a small neighborhood may have a big impact on long-term dynamics on that in the larger landscape. The remember stuff Christian has already mentioned, you know, these could be things like, you know, part of the forest may burn up, you have neighboring sites that put seed in it, you have maybe neighboring sites that harbor animals that carry the seed in it, and so there is a larger scale memory effect that influences what happens at smaller scale conditions on that. And it's really that interaction of the small and large scales that is really important on that, I guess. The one thing to kind of point out, usually when we talk about small scale, talking about faster changes, and large scale, a little bit slower changes on that. Think about that. To build up the memory, to build up those big logs or the seed production will take longer. We can change local fire conditions in an afternoon, because if you have the right tools, right? Go along with that. And the ticket really is to kind of think about these various scales, and you'll be challenged to do that. You know, the problems create when you have the small scale go into the release phase, and the next scale here is close to the release phase too, and you get this synchronizing effect that carries it forward on that. So you want to think about that if you have, you know, part of your landscape very susceptible to fire. You want to think about that maybe other parts of the landscape you want to have fire breaks in on that. So you set them up, and you get close to this K stage. You want to think about when you're not focused about growth, when you talk about capacity building, setting it up for future disturbances. Or you want to make sure, maybe you don't want to stop the fire, but you want to make sure you have species in the system that can sprout back after fire. another example, how to do capacity building on that. So if you don't have that, if you have various scales simultaneously in that conservation phase, the problem is you may get this spin-off that it kind of carries through the system. But something that starts out as a very small scale disturbance may actually spin out into a larger scale problem. But then pushes your ecosystem outside that social acceptable boundary that I showed earlier on. So how do you come up, actually, well, the thing I'd like you to do, or it came up for the exercise, is to kind of start thinking about ecosystems in this Panarchy vision on that. And I kind of look at this Panarchy thing as kind of a generic model approach setup, where you know certain phases that go through, and think about how your system fits into that, or what the system, how you would represent the system if it fits into that. And then you can learn quite a bit of what are some of the drivers that start a revolt or that keep a revolt from spinning through the various scales. And here's one example that people used actually from the Alpine European Alps, so we have the Italian connection there, where they kind of looked at some ecosystem, and you'll go through that, where you start simple before you get into the fancy modeling and drawing things, is think about what are some of the major stages here, what are some of the basics of attractions, what are some of the drivers that would flip the system from one basin to the other on that. And you'll have some guidance with questions and tables to kind of start to have you think about that. You know, and especially in the exercise, we kind of combine that with the idea of scales too. We have to start thinking about scales as well as uncertainty on that. But if you start in a system and kind of looking at what are the various, you know, basins, what are the various circles that the system can play in, and what would flip it from one circle to the other. This would be a simplified way of doing it. Then you start kind of taking this, you know, putting it into this model, twisting it, so to speak. I should actually have a model to do that in the future. We should build one. And you come up with something like this. This is kind of the same thing from the picture before. You have a cycle here that is alpine grasslands, and then it kind of goes up into woodlands on that. And of course, the third axis here is the cycle speed. In grasslands, you have a lot of annual turnover of species. If you think about that, to build up woodlands takes a lot longer on that, especially if you want to maintain it there. You have capital. I'll talk about that in a minute, what that means in a Panarchy cycle on that. Actually, maybe I can start with that. Capital is really, in some ways, for the purpose of the exercise, and to me, for the purpose of thinking of ecosystems, is what's your desired goal that you want to achieve with that. So the standard one I've seen used is if you have conservation values, you know, you want to maintain, like in the Pacific Northwest, we want to maintain habitat for the spotted owl on public land. It's in the law, it's the Northwest Forest Plan. So anything I can relate to habitat of spotted owl, if I get more of it, that increases my capital. Makes sense? You could, I guess, in that sense, have timber production as well on there. If you think about connectedness, that is really, you know, how many interactions do you see? It increases over time. And so that's really, in some ways, how self-organized the system is, if you want to call it that. You know, if you start with more species, quite likely there's more interaction and connections over time. So you have facilitation going on, competition, various interactions like that. So it's a combination of a time component as well as diversity component on that. And obviously right after release, you know, you lose that connectedness of the species as they reassemble in the process. So you can start thinking about ecosystems, whether you can graph them in a way like this on that. And I'll have a few other examples here.
Could we just go back to the original
Panarchy?
yeah, Panarchy?
Because you will be a panarchist this afternoon.
Yeah, we just added a PDF.
It's funny enough for her. So here they call this potential, and I think for measurement, I'll get into that in a minute. I like the idea of the capital a little better than that.
So basically, when you figure out the logic, but when you start exploiting, when the ecosystem is reorganizing, you're losing capital. Is that it? At
No,
the far,
actually,
at
this-
the far left.
This goes up, I mean, in this exploitation during growth phase, you can look at capital here as biomass.
Yeah.
Like it's living biomass.
Yeah.
On
But
one end,
it's,
on
not,
one end.
it's just at the far left, and on that part.
This is, no, capital is the vertical dimension, so it's
Mhm.
potential.
Yeah, but from reorganization towards exploitation, you're losing capital. Why is that?
Well, this actually, you gotta be careful here about the graph. I think, I wouldn't, if you go for the ecosystem, your scale won't be the same once you start putting measures on it. This is scale 3 on that. And so I think when they come through here as you reorganize, I'm not sure, there may be a phase when you don't have enough biomass as part of the disturbance. There may be a phase when you go through, maybe it's the stem exclusion phase, where you don't have the desired conservation values there.
But it's 2D, but it should be 3Ds, and I think the exploitation is above the reorganization in terms of capital, but because it's put in 2D.
Yeah, I have some 3D pictures,
Yeah.
but I think this graph here is conceptual. They don't have a scale on here. And I seriously doubt, I mean, they have this one a little bit higher. And probably for the real, if you take real measures, this would come down and maybe this one would go up, but the difference would be exaggerated on that. So right now, I'm just trying to get you to think in those terms.
But-
of
Let's
that.
just keep that, because I'll make a link with the lab we will go in a site that is here. And we'll walk to a site that was caught around 40, 50 years ago. Marty mentioned it yesterday. So then we will be walking through a forest that is here, because it's an old growth forest. So we will walk through this old growth forest, we'll go there, and then one part of your exercise will, and we know there was a clear cut here, and we know that this was an old growth before, and so we will talk about this cycle, and you will see the exercise, but you could start to simulate conceptually how the stand will evolve in the future, and in the future there will be other disturbances that will be different than the previous disturbances, and there will be reorganization. So that will be the exercise.
Yeah. Actually, since you maybe go back to this one, the arrows here actually are supposed to be a unit in time. So this means that this is a fairly slow process. All these long arrows tell them basically, you can look at it as a decade each, will go rather fast through that. So you have this different speed, or the systems move through those cycles as well. So this is just, I guess hopefully you can read it, lightly grazed pastures and grass-rich pastures. This kind of gets into the capital and connectedness stories a little bit more, kind of highlighting that. This is the example for the alpine meadows, and they kind of pointed out, the capital in this case is the conservation value, so the amount of desirable conservation species that are listed in the alpine countries there. And the connectedness, again, is kind of a measure of species diversity in that sense as well. So you have these two different management scenarios, and you'll see that they differ. And what I want to highlight, if it's lightly grazed, clearly you get higher capital. It goes up higher, so there is increased conservation value on that. There's even increased connectedness, you get more diversity. But what happens when it hits this? It slams down even harder on that. Well, the one that is, grass-rich pastures and that managed in a way will never get that full exploitation, but it stays, I guess, in that sense, a little closer together in terms of the variation you see in the cycle. So those are things you need to consider if you push it. In this case, to dominance of one objective on that, you can reach that objective. I guess through focus management a little harder, but you set yourself up for potential bigger crash in the end. This is a good example where they. So one, I guess, just to kind of bring up this cycle idea and where it makes sense is you can look at the national economy and how these things kind of interacted. And what really happened on that is, as the homeowners started default on mortgages, the banks were in a terrible condition. They had leveraged themselves with these mortgages to the max. So they were sitting here right at this K phase, at the deterioration phase. And that's why this could spin out of control. And the economies, of course, the national economies relied on the banks, relied on the construction boom and all that stuff. And that spun them out of control too. So this is a good example where, you know, when you think about this in these terms, there are 3 different scales at 3 different levels. They were in a very sensitive conservation phase. And when the bottom started going out, it just went right through the system. So when you think about the stand now, again, as Christian kind of pointed out, will probably be closer here in the exploitation phase. You want to think about how much you want to push that exploitation phase. When you want to start thinking about stopping that growth, don't push that capital to the max, but work on adaptive capacity on that. And at what scale do you want to do it? You can do it at, I guess, a landscape scale for certain things and for certain somewhat habitat and stuff, that may be the proper scale. But of course, you know, anything you do, you got to assess to this range of scales. That's all I have. So hopefully, I did an exercise, not actually a few years back, I wasn't as prepared as I was this time, but down in Chile with a bunch of professors, as it turned out, so I was kind of a little taken back when I came in rather than having grad students. No offense to grad students, were all these young faculty members with fresh PhDs that taught all this ecology. But it was really cool. We had a variety of expertise in it, and at the end, almost when you walk through the forest, you started thinking of things as cycles like this. This Panarchy cycle was in everybody's brain on that. And hopefully by now you have an idea why, you know, we think there is some really usefulness to thinking of forests in those cycles, in those cross-scale hierarchies and stuff, which then allows us, if you start thinking in cross-scale hierarchies, thresholds, nonlinearities, then we can learn a lot from complexity science, from theory of complexity science, that tells us how do systems change, how do they respond to perturbations. And hopefully that means we don't have to make all these mistakes more than once.
So Klaus, you want to